The dust of the high desert settled on everything at Blackwood Air Base, a fine, gritty powder that coated the immaculate hangars and the razor-wire fences with a veneer of impermanence. It was a place built to defy nature, a bastion of advanced technology and rigid order carved into a landscape that promised only heat and emptiness. Into this world of sharp lines and sharper attitudes walked a woman who seemed to be made of softer, quieter things. Vance carried a single duffel bag. Her clothes were simple, functional civilian wear, dark slacks, and a gray shirt that seemed to absorb the harsh sunlight rather than reflect it. She offered her identification at the main gate to two young airmen who radiated the bored authority of their post. One of them took the card, his eyes flicking from the plastic to her face with a disinterest so profound it was almost an art form. He ran it through the scanner. A low beep confirmed her clearance. Vance, civilian contractor, legacy systems analysis, he recited, his voice flat. He handed the card back without another look. Simulator wing is Sector Gamma. Follow the yellow line on the tarmac. Don't deviate. The other guard was already looking past her, his gaze sweeping the empty expanse of road leading to the base, searching for a distraction more interesting than a mid-level analyst. She was a footnote before she had even stepped past the gate. She nodded, the gesture so small it was barely a movement, and began her walk along the prescribed yellow line. The air thrummed with a distant scream of fighter jets practicing maneuvers, a sound of immense power that she seemed not to notice. Her focus was on the ground, on the way the heat shimmered above the asphalt, on the precise geometry of the base. She was a ghost entering a machine, her presence logged but not truly registered. In the administrative office for Sector Gamma, a harried clerk sifted through a stack of digital files, his brow furrowed in annoyance. Vance? Vance? I don't see an intake packet for you. He didn't look up. Alara stood patiently before his desk, her duffel bag resting on the floor beside her. She didn't speak, didn't shift her weight, didn't clear her throat. She simply waited, a study in stillness that was subtly unnerving in the frantic environment. Finally, with an exasperated sigh, the clerk found her file buried under a mislabeled directory. Ah, here you are. Sent over from the Pentagon's acquisitions department. Right, he still didn't make eye contact, instead tapping a few keys and assigning her a temporary security fob. Barracks are that way. Briefing with Colonel Thorne is at 0800 tomorrow in the main comms room. Don't be late. The colonel does not like lateness. He slid the fob across the counter. The interaction was over. She was processed, filed away, another cog of unknown size and purpose slotted into the vast, grinding apparatus of the military. As she left, the clerk had already forgotten her, his attention consumed by the next urgent email. Alara found her small, sterile room in the civilian quarters. It was identical to 1,000 other rooms on 100 other bases. She unpacked with an economy of motion that was almost unnerving, each item placed with intention. A few changes of clothes, a well-worn book, a small, polished stone she set on the nightstand. She didn't inspect her surroundings or test the mattress. She stood for a moment in the center of the room, listening to the hum of the building's ventilation, feeling the rhythm of the base. She was a foreign element, an unknown variable, and she could feel the system's inert resistance to her presence. It didn't want to know her. It wanted only to categorize her and, if possible, ignore her. That, she knew, was a state that could be used to her advantage. The base saw a quiet woman in a gray shirt. It did not see the coiled stillness within, the discipline forged in places far harsher than this polished desert installation. The main communications room was cold, the air chilled to a precise temperature designed to keep the servers from overheating and the officers from dozing off. It smelled of ozone and institutional coffee. Colonel Marcus Thorne stood before a holographic display, a man who seemed to have been forged from the same steel and wire as the base he commanded. His uniform was flawless, his posture ramrod straight, his gaze sweeping over the assembled pilots and technicians with an expression of permanent, low-grade dissatisfaction. He was a man who believed in structure, in protocol, in the clear, unambiguous lines of authority. Vance, seated in the back row as instructed, was an anomaly he did not appreciate. His eyes found her, a single civilian in a sea of flight suits. "We'll begin," he announced, his voice a clipped baritone that tolerated no interruption. He ran through the morning's agenda, his words precise and economical. He spoke of readiness levels, maintenance schedules, and the upcoming Joint Forces exercise, Desert Fury. It was this exercise that occupied his mind. The entire exercise hinges on our ability to train our pilots against a new generation of adversary drone technology. These drones, as you know, are programmed to mimic the flight patterns of the XA-7 Wraith. A murmur went through the younger pilots. The Wraith was a legend, a ghost aircraft from a black-budget program decades ago, rumored to be so difficult to fly that it was abandoned. Its simulator was now their primary tool for preparing for the unpredictable enemy they were about to face. Thorne's gaze settled on Alara again. To that end, the Department of Defense has seen fit to send us an analyst to observe our methods. He picked up a tablet and read her name aloud, mispronouncing it slightly. Ms. Alara Vance, from the Legacy Systems Analysis Division. Ms. Vance is here to generate a report on the cost-effectiveness of our training program. The way he said report made it sound like an autopsy. He set the tablet down. "Ms. Vance," he said, addressing her directly, his tone dripping with condescension. "I trust your analysis won't interfere with my pilot's actual training. We have a war to prepare for, not a budget meeting." A few of the younger officers smirked. She was, in their eyes, exactly what he implied, a bureaucratic pencil pusher sent from a distant office to question their work without understanding it. Alara met his gaze. She did not flinch, nor did she offer a deferential smile. She simply held his stare for a beat longer than was comfortable, her expression unreadable. "I will be unobtrusive, Colonel," she said. Her voice was quiet, yet it carried across the cold room with perfect clarity, cutting through the low hum of the servers. It was a voice devoid of apology or defensiveness. It was a statement of fact. Thorne was momentarily taken aback by her lack of deference. He expected a nervous stammer, a quick assurance. He got none. He narrowed his eyes, then dismissed her with a curt nod, turning back to the holographic display. "Very well, Lieutenant Jennings, you're up first in the simulator this morning. Let's see if you can last longer than 3 minutes against the Wraith protocol." The target of his comment, Lieutenant K. Jennings, a cocky pilot with a swagger that preceded him by several feet, grinned. "No problem, sir. I got that rust bucket's number today." As the briefing concluded and the pilots filed out, their conversation loud and boastful, Alara remained seated. She watched them go, her eyes analytical. She saw the confidence, but she also saw the subtle tension in their shoulders, the false bravado. The colonel saw a problem of pilot skill. The pilot saw a problem with an old machine. Alara was beginning to suspect the problem was something else entirely, something no one here had the perspective to see. She was a ghost in their machine, and from the shadows, a ghost can see everything. For 3 days, Alara became part of the background scenery in the simulator bay. The bay was a cavernous, dimly lit space, dominated by the hulking shell of the Wraith simulator. It was an ugly, angular machine, a relic from a different era of design philosophy, all hard lines and exposed conduits. The air inside was thick with the scent of hot electronics and the lingering sweat of frustrated pilots. She chose a small, overlooked observation nook with a clear view of both the simulator's cockpit screen and the main diagnostic panels. She said nothing. She took no notes. She simply watched. She watched Lieutenant Jennings, his knuckles white on the control stick as the simulated alarms blared, his face a mask of fury when the screen flashed with the words "Mission Failure." She watched him emerge, cursing the antiquated junk and its impossible physics. She watched other pilots, each one a top graduate from their class, suffer the same fate. They were all approaching it the same way, with aggression, with speed, trying to force the machine to bend to their will. They were fighting the simulator. They were not flying it. Her gaze would often drift from the frantic energy of the pilots to a small, faded tattoo just visible on the inside of her wrist. It was a simple design, rendered in black ink that had softened to gray over the years. A stylized bird of prey in a steep dive, a single, sharp star clutched in its talons. To anyone else, it was a meaningless piece of ink. To her, it was a memory of a time when the hum of a cockpit was her native language. It was the insignia of a unit that officially never existed, for a program that was buried so deep it had become a myth. Her hand would unconsciously come to rest over it, her thumb tracing the outline of the wing, a gesture of quiet communion with a past no one here could possibly comprehend. While the technicians and engineers focused on the software, running endless diagnostics that always came back clean, Alara's attention was on the hardware's subtle feedback loops. She noticed things. A flicker on a tertiary power conduit that lasted only a millisecond when the pilot pulled high-G maneuvers. A barely audible whine from the gyroscopic stabilizers that was just outside the frequency range the automated sensors were programmed to flag. She saw a slight lag, no more than a few hundredths of a second, between control input and system response in the yaw thrusters. The pilots felt it as sluggishness. The techs dismissed it as a software bottleneck. Alara recognized it as a physical misalignment, a tiny imperfection with cascading consequences. She knew this machine, not from a manual, but from memory. She knew its temperament, its quirks, its violent rejection of those who did not approach it with respect. The simulator wasn't just running a program. It was a perfect digital recreation of a deeply flawed, breathtakingly powerful aircraft. Flying the Wraith wasn't about overpowering it. It was about forming a partnership, about anticipating its savage eccentricities and turning them into strengths. These pilots, for all their talent, were trying to tame a beast that could only be guided. One afternoon, after another disastrous session, Lieutenant Jennings stormed past her, throwing his helmet onto a bench. "It's a waste of time," he vented to another pilot. "No real aircraft handles like that. It's broken." "The whole program is broken." Alara's eyes followed him, her expression unchanging. He was wrong. The simulation wasn't broken. It was perfect. It was perfectly replicating an aircraft that demanded a pilot of a caliber that this base, and perhaps this entire generation of flyers, had never been required to produce. She lowered her gaze back to her wrist, to the diving bird of prey. It was a symbol of a forgotten philosophy, a reminder that the most dangerous weapon is not the machine, but the perfect symbiotic union between the machine and its master. And in this place of polished surfaces and digital precision, that union had been completely, utterly forgotten. The date for the Desert Fury exercise loomed, a stark deadline on every monitor in the command center. Colonel Thorne's mood had soured from its usual dissatisfaction into a state of barely concealed fury. The data from the simulator runs was appalling. His top pilots, the pride of his command, were being systematically humiliated by a 20-year-old piece of hardware. Their scores against the Wraith protocol were so low that the Central Command's readiness algorithms were flagging Blackwood as a critical failure point for the entire exercise. The new adversary drones, which the Wraith simulation was meant to prepare them for, were being delivered in 2 days. If his pilots couldn't handle the simulation, they would be torn apart by the real thing. The pressure was immense, coming down from the Pentagon in a series of increasingly curt and demanding communiques. Thorne's career and the reputation of his base was on the line. He stalked through the simulator bay like a caged predator, his presence making the already tense technicians flinch. "What is the problem?" he demanded of the lead engineer. "Is it the software, the hardware, or are the pilots you're giving me incompetent?" The engineer, a civilian named Harris, wiped sweat from his brow. "Sir, all diagnostics are green. We've run every test. The system is operating exactly to its design specifications. It's just a brutally difficult simulation." Thorne's face hardened. "That is not an answer, Mr. Harris. That is an excuse." The breaking point came during what was meant to be a final high-pressure test run. Lieutenant Jennings was back in the cockpit, his jaw set, his earlier bravado replaced by a grim determination. Thorne and a half-dozen senior officers watched from the observation room. This time, Jennings tried a different tactic, flying more cautiously, trying to anticipate the simulation's moves. For a few minutes, it seemed to work. He evaded the first 2 simulated attacks. A flicker of hope went through the room. Then he banked hard, pushing the simulated aircraft into a high-angle climb. A cascade of alarms shrieked through the speakers. On the main screen, the attitude indicator began to spin wildly. "I've lost control." Jennings's voice, tight with panic, crackled over the comms. "It's a flat spin. I can't recover." The screen showed a terrifying, dizzying view of the desert floor spinning up to meet him. The technicians frantically typed commands, trying to override the system, but it was too late. The screen went black, followed by the cold, digital words, "Catastrophic hull failure. Mission failure." Jennings emerged from the simulator, his face pale, his flight suit soaked with sweat. He tore his helmet off and slammed it onto the console. "The gyros are shot," he yelled, his voice ragged. "The second I put any real stress on the airframe, the whole thing just gives up. It's garbage." The other pilots murmured in agreement. The technicians looked helpless. Colonel Thorne stood rigid, his face a granite mask of controlled rage. The program was a failure. His pilots were unprepared. His command was compromised. All of it was unraveling because of one obsolete, stubborn machine. Through it all, Vance sat in her corner, a pool of absolute calm in the swirling vortex of panic and frustration. She had seen the infinitesimal flicker on the power conduit just before the spin. She had heard the almost imperceptible change in pitch from the gyroscopic housing. They were symptoms of a disease no one else knew how to diagnose. The pressure had reached its peak. The system was about to break. And in the quiet space of imminent failure, an opportunity was about to present itself. That night, the simulator bay was silent, a tomb of technology bathed in the dim, blue glow of standby lights. The frantic energy of the day had dissipated, leaving behind an air of defeat. Master Sergeant Reyes, a man with 25 years of service etched into the lines on his face, was the only one left. He wasn't a pilot or an engineer, but a crew chief of the old school who believed any machine could be understood if you just listened to it long enough. He had a wrench in his hand and a diagnostic tablet propped on a tool cart. His expression one of profound frustration. He was tapping at a panel on the simulator's base, getting the same all systems nominal reading for the 10th time. A soft footstep made him turn. It was Vance, the quiet analyst from the Pentagon. She stood a few feet away, her hands in her pockets. "They've all given up for the night," Reyes said, his voice gravelly with fatigue. "It wasn't a question. They're trying to solve a hardware problem with software," she replied, her voice calm and even in the echoing silence. Reyes grunted, a sound of cynical agreement. "Tell me something I don't know." He was about to turn back to his work, dismissing her as he would any other civilian. But she didn't leave. She stepped closer, her eyes fixed on a specific diagnostic panel he had been ignoring, one that monitored the micro-voltage fluctuations in the gyroscopic dampeners. "The gyroscopic dampener is misaligned," she said, her voice soft but certain. "By 002 degrees. It's creating a cascade failure in the yaw control when the system is under high G load." Reyes stopped. He stared at her. Not even the factory engineers had suggested something so specific. "How in the hell would you know that?" "I read the manual," she said, without a hint of irony. It was a dismissal, a piece of misdirection, so blatant it was almost honest. Reyes looked from her calm, unreadable face to the panel. It was a complex recalibration, one that required manual overrides. It was a long shot, but every other option had failed. "Fine," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He keyed in the override codes and, following her impossibly precise instruction, made the minuscule adjustment. He then ran a deep-level diagnostic. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a single line of red text on his tablet vanished, replaced by green. The subharmonic whine that had been a constant, almost subliminal presence in the bay ceased. The silence that replaced it was profound. Reyes stared at the screen, then back at Alara. His skepticism was dissolving, replaced by a deep, unsettling curiosity. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low. "Just an analyst," she said. She then nodded toward the simulator's open cockpit. May I run a diagnostic from the pilot's seat? It's the only way to confirm the fix under a dynamic load. He hesitated for only a second. Protocol was screaming at him to say no. A civilian had no business in the seat of a classified military simulator. But instinct, honed by decades of experience, told him he was in the presence of something far outside the regulations. Go ahead, he said. Alara slid into the pilot's seat. There was no hesitation, no fumbling for controls. Her hands moved over the console with a familiar, fluid grace, like a concert pianist returning to a beloved instrument. Her fingers danced across buttons and switches, her movements economical and precise. She initiated a diagnostic sequence, but she didn't just let it run. She began to fly. On the observer screen, Reyes watched in disbelief. The Wraith avatar on the screen wasn't just flying, it was alive. It performed a flawless vertical climb, then transitioned into a controlled stall, recovering with a flick of the controls that seemed to defy the laws of physics. It moved with a lethal grace he had never seen before. She wasn't just running a diagnostic. She was dancing with a ghost, and for the first time, the ghost was dancing back. The next morning, the atmosphere in the simulator bay had shifted. The frantic panic was gone, replaced by a low hum of confused whispers. Master Sergeant Reyes had quietly informed the engineering team of the calibration error he had discovered overnight. The system was stable, but no one understood why. Reyes found Lieutenant Jennings by the coffee machine, looking tired and defeated. You need to see something, sir, Reyes said, his tone respectful but firm. It's about the simulator, Jennings scoffed. Don't tell me you fixed that relic with a wrench. Master Sergeant, not me, sir, Reyes replied, lowering his voice. It was the woman, the analyst. Vance, he described what he had witnessed the night before. The impossible diagnosis, the flawless flight. She flies it like she was born in it. There's something you need to know about her. Jennings was skeptical, but Reyes's conviction was unshakable. The Master Sergeant was not a man given to flights of fancy. A seed of doubt about the quiet woman in the gray shirt was planted. The opportunity to see for himself came sooner than expected. Colonel Thorne called another briefing, his mood no better than the day before. He had the report about the fix, but remained unconvinced. A minor calibration issue does not explain weeks of catastrophic failure, he stated, his eyes scanning the room. The fundamental problem remains. Our pilots cannot handle this platform, which means they are not ready for Desert Fury. That was when Alara spoke. Her voice, from the back of the room, was not loud, but it sliced through the Colonel's pronouncement with surgical precision. The failure isn't the pilots, Colonel, and it wasn't the hardware. Every eye in the room turned to her. Colonel Thorne is fascinerend. He was not accustomed to being contradicted, especially by a civilian analyst he had already dismissed. Then enlighten us, Ms. Vance, he said, his voice dangerously soft. What, in your expert analysis, is the problem? Alara stood up slowly. It's the simulation's interpretation of adversary doctrine, she said simply. The Wraith was not a brawler. It was an ambush predator. It was designed to exploit blind spots and sensor gaps that don't exist in a head-on-head engagement. Your pilots are trying to dogfight a ghost. The simulation is predictable because you're using it predictably. You're training them to fight the last war, not the next 1 inch. A stunned silence filled the room. She had just, in a few calm sentences, dismantled the entire training philosophy of his base. The arrogance in the room curdled into disbelief. Lieutenant Jennings stared at her, Reyes's words from that morning echoing in his mind. Colonel Thorne looked as if he'd been struck. It was an audacious, almost insubordinate claim. He was about to put her in her place, to tear her amateur assessment apart, when Master Sergeant Reyes spoke up, his voice a solid anchor in the quiet room. Sir, he said, directing his words to Thorne, with all due respect, she might be onto something. I saw her run a diagnostic last night. You should see what she can do. Thorne was caught between his rigid adherence to protocol and the undeniable fact that this woman, this quiet, unassuming analyst, had seemingly solved a problem his entire technical staff could not. His desperation warred with his pride. He looked at Alara, truly looked at her for the first time and saw not a meek bureaucrat, but a figure of unshakable, unnerving confidence. The entire program was on the brink of collapse. He had nothing left to lose. "Fine, Ms. Vance," Thorne said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Show us." The challenge hung in the air, thick and heavy. "Show us." It was a command born of desperation and a desire to publicly humiliate the woman who had dared to question his command. Colonel Thorne led the way back to the simulator bay, his senior officers and pilots following like a grim procession. The word had spread quickly. The bay, usually occupied by a handful of technicians, was now lined with curious and skeptical onlookers. They were there to see the civilian analyst get put in her place. Thorne gestured to the two networked simulators, the primary one still open from Alara's diagnostic. "Lieutenant Jennings," he barked, "get in Simulator 2. You will fly a standard combat patrol pattern." Then he turned to Alara. "Ms. Vance, you will be in Simulator 1. You will be the adversary. Your objective is to intercept and neutralize him." We will all be watching Jennings, his pride stung by her earlier critique and now fueled by desire for vindication. Shot her a confident smirk. He was back in his element, about to face off against a pencil pusher. This would be easy. Alara simply nodded and walked to the Wraith simulator. She slid into the seat, her movements fluid and economical. She strapped herself in, her face betraying no emotion. In the observation room, the main screen split, showing both pilots' perspectives and a tactical map of the engagement area. "Engage," Thorne commanded. On the screen, Jennings's F-35 Avatar roared to life, a sleek, powerful machine. He pushed his throttle forward, climbing fast, a predator seeking its prey. Alara's Wraith Avatar remained on the digital tarmac for a moment. Then, instead of a high-speed vertical takeoff, it lifted off gently, almost silently, and skimmed low over the simulated terrain, hugging the contours of the digital mountains. "What is she doing?" one of the pilots muttered. "She's hiding," Jennings said over the comms, a note of derision in his voice. "She can't hide from my sensors." On the tactical map, Jennings's plane was a bright, clear icon. Alara's was a ghost, flickering in and out of existence as she used the terrain to mask her signature. She wasn't running. She was hunting. Jennings grew impatient. He dove, sweeping the area with his advanced sensor suite. "About a faint signal," he announced. Moving to engage, he banked his jet and accelerated, confident he had her trapped. The observation room was silent, all eyes glued to the screens. They saw Jennings's perspective as he closed in on the last known position. He was expecting to find her cowering in a canyon. Instead, he found nothing. The sensor reading vanished. "Where did she go?" he murmured, confused. That was when it happened. On his screen, a proximity alarm shrieked. He looked up, and the Wraith was there, dropping on him from directly above, out of the sun's glare, a classic, forgotten maneuver that no modern system was programmed to anticipate. It had been hiding in plain sight, using the sun as cover. Before Jennings could even react, a simulated missile-lock tone blared in his ears. The screen flashed red. Weapon impact. Critical damage. His controls went dead. The entire engagement had lasted 97 seconds. A collective, stunned silence descended upon the observation room. No one moved. No one spoke. They had just witnessed their best pilot, in the most advanced simulated fighter jet, be surgically dismantled by a civilian in an obsolete machine. Jennings sat frozen in his cockpit, staring at his blank console. The swagger was gone, replaced by a profound, humbling shock. He finally unstrapped himself and emerged from the simulator, his face pale. He walked over to where Alara was climbing out of the Wraith's cockpit. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a dawning respect that bordered on awe. "Who?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Are you?" Alara met his gaze. She offered no explanation, no boast, no triumphant smile. She simply held his look for a moment before turning and walking away, leaving the entire command staff of Blackwood Air Base standing in stunned, reverent silence. Colonel Marcus Thorne felt as if the solid ground beneath his feet had turned to sand. The 97-second humiliation of his top pilot was not just a failure. It was an indictment of his entire understanding of modern air combat. The woman, Vance, had not just defeated Jennings. She had done it with a kind of lethal elegance that felt alien, ancient, and terrifyingly superior. Back in the sterile quiet of his office, the silence pressing in on him, he did what he should have done the day she arrived. He sat at his secure terminal and initiated a deep-level background check, using his own high-level command clearances. The initial file that appeared on his screen was exactly what he expected: thin, bureaucratic, and utterly mundane. Alara Vance, civilian analyst, grade GS-14, attached to the Department of Defense Acquisitions Command, Legacy Systems Division. Her service record was a blank slate. No military history. No notable commendations. It was a perfectly crafted fiction, designed to be unremarkable. But Thorne was a man who understood how the system worked. He knew that true secrets weren't kept in locked files. They were hidden behind files that looked too boring to open. Her access credentials for the Blackwood base, however, were unusually high. He used those credentials as a key, running her security signature against the deepest, most heavily encrypted archives in the Pentagon's network, the digital resting place of programs and personnel who had been officially erased. For a moment, the system resisted, demanding credentials he did not possess. Then, a flag on her file, a dormant subprotocol, recognized the inquiry originating from the site of the XA-7 Wraith simulator. A new authentication window appeared. Access granted. The screen flickered, and a new file materialized. It was stark, heavily redacted, and sent a chill down his spine. Service record: Vance Alara. Call sign Nix. Status: active, reserve, deep cover. The file was a ghost story written in official font. She was listed as the sole pilot and chief test operator for the XA-7 Wraith operational trials 20 years prior. There were redacted mission logs from theaters of war that were officially peaceful at the time. Commendations signed by 4-star generals whose names were legends. A note from the program director described her as having a preternatural symbiosis with the airframe, and another stated, "Subject Nix does not fly the Wraith. She convinces it to disobey the laws of physics." He saw the tattoo, the bird of prey with the star, listed as the official, though never worn, insignia of Project Nix. She wasn't here to analyze the program. She was the program. She was a living legend hiding in plain sight, sent to see what had become of her ghost. As Thorne stared, dumbfounded, at the screen, a priority alert flashed on his communications console. It was an encrypted message, routed from the Joint Special Operations Command. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. The message was brief and direct. To Co. Blackwood Air Base. From JSOC. Subject: Exercise Desert Fury. Confirming arrival of Asset Nix. Unit Spectre. En route for joint exercise integration. Await her instruction. Unit composition: 50 Marine Special Operations Raiders. Thorne read the message 3 times. Asset Nix. Unit Spectre. 50 of the most elite soldiers in the United States Marine Corps. And they were coming here, to his base, to await her instruction. The quiet woman in the gray shirt. The analyst he had dismissed. The pilot who had rewritten the rules of his sky. The pieces clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't in charge of her. She was about to be in charge of him. He leaned back in his chair, the cold authority draining from him, replaced by a profound, humbling awe. He had tried to put a ghost in a box, and the ghost had just revealed that it owned the entire building. The next morning broke clear and cold over the desert. The base was already buzzing with the story of the simulator duel. Alara Vance was no longer an invisible analyst. She was a mystery, a whispered legend in the making. The pilots who had once smirked at her now watched her with a mixture of fear and reverence. She ignored the whispers, the stares, the sudden deference. She ate breakfast alone in the mess hall, her routine unchanged. Then, she began her walk across the tarmac, heading toward the hangars that housed the Wraith simulator. The air began to thrum with a new sound, not the sharp scream of fighter jet, but the deep, percussive thumping of heavy rotor blades. Two unmarked H-53C Stallion helicopters appeared over the horizon, flying low and fast, their dark green fuselages stark against the pale blue sky. They didn't land on the main helipads. They bypassed standard procedure, heading directly for the wide expanse of tarmac near the simulator wing, landing with a precision that spoke of immense skill. As the rotors spun down, the rear ramps lowered. From the shadowy interiors, figures began to disembark. They moved with a fluid, disciplined urgency that was fundamentally different from the crisp formality of the base personnel. These were 50 men in full combat gear, their movements economical and predatory. They were Marine Raiders, the elite of the elite, and they scanned their surroundings with the cool, appraising eyes of men who were masters of any environment they entered. Their commander, a Marine major with a hard, chiseled face and the quiet intensity of a veteran of countless unseen conflicts, stepped off the ramp. His eyes swept the area, ignoring the gathering crowd of stunned base personnel. He was looking for someone. He saw Elara, walking steadily toward them, her simple civilian clothes a stark contrast to their formidable battle dress. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. He stopped, his posture straightening. He turned to face his men. "Unit," he barked, his voice a sharp, powerful crack in the morning air. "Attend tie-in." In a single, unified motion, 50 of the world's most dangerous soldiers snapped to perfect, rigid attention. Their weapons were held at parade rest, their gazes locked forward, their entire beings focused in a silent, powerful display of absolute respect. They were not looking at the base commander. They were not looking at the hangars. They were looking at Elara. The major strode forward, his boots crunching on the asphalt. He stopped 3 feet in front of her, his own bearing flawless. "Major Croft, commanding Spectre Unit," he announced, his voice clear and formal. "We are ready for tasking, ma'am." He then executed a salute so sharp, so precise, it seemed to cut the air. At that moment, Colonel Thorne and Lieutenant Jennings arrived, having run from the command center. They stopped dead, taking in the impossible scene. The quiet analyst holding 50 elite commandos at attention with her mere presence. Thorne's arrogance, his pride, his entire conception of rank and authority had been completely dismantled. He saw not Ms. Vance, the bureaucratic nuisance, but Nix, the living weapon, the commander to whom even a hardened Raider major deferred. He walked forward slowly, his steps measured. He passed the major, stopping beside him. He looked at Elara, at the quiet strength in her eyes, and for the first time, he understood. He raised his hand in a slow, perfect salute, an admission of his own blindness and a profound gesture of earned respect. Elara surveyed the scene. The 50 waiting soldiers, the saluting major, the humbled colonel. She offered no grand speech, no triumphant declaration. She simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. The transformation of Blackwood Air Base was silent but absolute. The arrival of Spectre Unit was like the introduction of a new center of gravity. The Raiders moved with a quiet purpose that made the base's rigid protocols seem clumsy and loud. They did not fraternize. They prepared. They unpacked specialized equipment, calibrated advanced communications gear, and studied satellite imagery on hardened tablets, all with an air of lethal focus. And at the center of this whirlwind of hypercompetence was Elara. She was their commander, their asset, Nix, yet she issued her orders not in briefings or shouted commands, but in quiet conversations with Major Croft, pointing to specific map coordinates or suggesting tactical approaches that were unorthodox yet brilliant. The final image of this new reality, the one that would be seared into the memory of every person on the base, took place in the now-hallowed Simulator Bay. Elara stood before the XA-7 Wraith simulator, the machine that had been the source of so much frustration and was now a symbol of her hidden power. The 50 Raiders were arrayed behind her, not in a formal attention, but in a state of professional readiness, checking their gear, their movements a symphony of deadly efficiency. She placed a hand on the cold, gray metal of the simulator shell. It was a gesture of communion, a quiet acknowledgement of a long and complicated partnership. The machine hummed softly, its standby lights casting a blue glow on her face. To Thorne and Jennings, who watched from a respectful distance, the machine no longer looked like a relic. It looked like a slumbering beast, and she was the only one who knew how to wake it. Her other hand rested near her wrist, and the light from the console screens caught the faded ink of her tattoo. The bird of prey, the diving ghost of Project Nyx, seemed to flicker with a renewed life. It was a symbol of a promise she had made long ago, to be faster, smarter, and more ruthless than any enemy. She had not come to Blackwood to file a report. She had come to awaken a capability, to remind a new generation that the most advanced technology is worthless without the human element that can push it beyond its limits. She had changed everything, not with words, not with complaints, not with an appeal to authority, but with the silent, undeniable weight of her own excellence. Her quiet strength had bent the rigid structure of the institution around her, forcing it to recognize a power it had forgotten existed. The hum of the machine was no longer a sound of obsolescence. It was a quiet promise. The real training, the one that would prepare them for desert fury and the wars of the future, was about to begin. She turned from the simulator, her gaze sweeping over the ready faces of Spectre Unit, and gave a single, final